Connect Run Club podcast, episode number 91. Joe Friel. Hey, welcome back, runners, to the Connect Run Club podcast. Excited to be with you today.
Yep.
And hey, episode 91, Brandon, let's hope by the time we get episode 100, the temperature and the episode numbers will not be the same, because right now it's flipping.
It is
hot.
91, yeah.
It is 91.
Yeah, it could be 100 though. I mean, I guess that's what, 3 months from now?
No,
that's quick because we're doing 2 weeks now.
Yeah, so we're 9 weeks away from episode 100.
Yeah, we are. But so we've got a fun interview for you guys. This one's a little bit different than our normal ones because this is actually kind of the master of triathlon. So he kind of like Hal Higdon is to running. This guy is to the triathlon.
Yeah,
so,
this guy is probably, in my mind, is probably one of the biggest names, if not the biggest name, from a coaching and training standpoint.
Yep.
But he's a big time runner. Opened up one. I didn't know this until I dug into his background, but opened one of the first running stores in the country. I think there are only 4 or 5 running stores in the country.
I didn't know that. Yeah.
So yeah.
And then he tried to turn it into a triathlon store, and there were like 20 triathletes in the city. So
they're like, yay!
Didn't quite work.
No.
But yeah, so this is great. You guys will get some running pieces out of this because that is a third of the triathlon. But you guys have ever wondered about triathlons? Is this something I could do? He dives into it. And this is actually the book that I read when I first started getting into tries.
Really?
The Beginner's Guide or whatever it's called, his Master's Guide. But he does some really good stuff on how to plan the year. But we talk just a lot of just training in general. So.
And he also gets in a little bit athletes that are more like me and less like you, a little bit older, like myself, about how we can stay healthy and recover well. So
yep, he's Fast After 50. We talk about it a little bit. He's got a new book out. So we've got that linked in the show notes, so you guys can check that out. But yeah, he's a blast to talk with. So
maybe it gives you some encouragement to even do some more cross training, cycling and swimming. So as we talk about, we have another cool episode next week as we talk about how becoming a better athlete will make you a better runner. It seems counterintuitive at the time, but one of the things that we're going to learn in the next couple of weeks is there's a limitation of what you can do from a running perspective. And so how can you become a better runner? You can become a better runner by becoming a better athlete. Yeah,
that's good. Yeah, and so next week, episode 92 is going to be with Jim Vance talking about a power meter, which, if you guys, you might have heard about him with biking. And so it basically measures your force over a distance as your power. And he has worked with a company, and they now have him for running. And it's so early, we asked him, like, so how would you use this to help train? He's like, you know what? I don't really know yet, but the data's good. So it's some really crazy stuff. You guys might be familiar, especially you're going to run by pace, and then your next step is kind of run by your heart rate. But then after that is add in this power piece, because that's totally different, how that can help your run. So
they're still learning what they're going to learn.
Right.
That's what's funny, because me and you left a little confused. We're like, that's because they're still learning what they're going to learn from all of this. So that's revolutionary and cutting edge, though. Definitely.
So that's next week. And then we're kind of giving a long intro because we've got some fun ones coming up. And then the weeks after that, we're getting into the Olympic season. And so we're going to have some fun stuff. We're going to do some previews of the Olympics with the trials up in Oregon. We're going to talk about, as well as some crazy stories from the past and some stories from the future. So stay tuned for all of that in the fun Olympic coverage.
Absolutely.
But we could not go into the intro without mentioning our summer running challenge, which I'm going to throw up on the screen. So that's happening right now. This is Thursday of the first week. And you guys can actually still be a part of it if you guys go to connectrunclub.com /summer challenge. And then you guys can be a part. And we're doing a giveaway every week. This week, we're doing $20 to Amazon. You can use to your choice. Yeah, because it was Amazon Prime Day on Tuesday, which wasn't a big deal like it was last year. But anyway, so you guys can buy running stuff or just get whatever you want. But at the end of all 4 weeks, if you guys compete in the challenge, you're entered to win a pair of running shoes.
And Brandon swam one day this week, didn't you?
I swam 2 days. I swam yesterday, yeah.
Look at you.
Yeah, I'm going. Yeah, so, and the challenge is 20-minute workouts. It doesn't have to be running. Mine have been swimming lately because it's hot. 3 times a week. and then 4 weeks. So you guys can start when this goes live on Thursday of our first week and hit Friday, Saturday, Sunday and still be entered to win. But even if you're listening to this after, if we're still in that 4-week period going into August, you guys can compete weekly. But even if not, you guys can check us out at the Summer Challenge as well as on Facebook. We have a fun Facebook group going.
We do.
ConnectRunClub.com/Facebook. Almost 1,000 people in it. So, and that is where we pull our Q&A with Coach Trey, which goes out on Thursdays as well.
There you go.
Well, good stuff, guys. Well, let's jump into the interview and learn all about triathlons.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Joe, for spending a few minutes with us. I am truly excited to have a chance to talk with you today, and looking forward to having our audience. I would think most runners I know, even whether they're triathletes or not, know your name, and so excited to kind of dive into your story a little bit today.
Oh, happy to do it. Thanks for asking me, Trey.
Absolutely. So Joe, you've been in the now. Correct me if I'm wrong. Are you retired now? Are you coaching athletes at all anymore? Or are you kind of done coaching athletes now?
Yeah, I don't coach athletes anymore. I retired from coaching athletes about 4 years ago.
Okay.
Now I just coach coaches and a few other things around the edges. I do seminars and write books and such.
Nice. Now you do a lot of your coaching and coaching coaches. A lot of that's on Training Peaks. Is that right?
Well, I do things on behalf of Training Peaks.
Okay,
It involves
gotcha.
training coaches on how to do for example, design training plans for athletes. Yeah, so that's one of the things I do. But I do other clinics also for athletes and coaches, actually around the world. I'm going to Norway next month, for example,
Nice.
and there's a lot of things going on after that, Chile and so forth. But basically, I finally I coached, started in the 1980s when I started coaching endurance athletes, and finally by 2012, I decided it was time to quit doing that and spend more time just working with coaches.
That's great. In fact, we just a few minutes ago, I think we were talking to one of your former athletes, Jim Vance. So had a chance to talk with him a few minutes ago, and he kind of blew us away with all of the numbers and the running with power. So it's amazing how new that technology is and what it could potentially do for runners around the world. So it was really exciting to talk with him.
Yeah, you were talking to the right guy. Jim just wrote I'm sure you know, just wrote a book on how to use a power meter for running, and it's certainly much more complex than a power meter for cycling. And I'm sure he went into all that with you, but it's cutting edge stuff. We're still in the early stage of trying to figure out how to use all this data, but I think it will have a lot to do with how well athletes runners train in the future. Once we figured out all the details of how to use the data, it's completely changed the way cyclists train, and I'm sure it'll change running also.
That's really exciting. Well, Joe, would love to kind of get into your background a little bit and how you got into running in the first place. I know you were one of the pioneers from running stores and then also from coaching triathletes, but we'd love to get a little bit of your background and how you got into the running industry in the first place.
Yeah, happy to do that. I started running when I was 12 years old, and ran junior high school track, and then high school track, and then college ran track. And after college, took a couple of years off, actually about 3 years off from running, and then started again while I was in Vietnam. Actually, I started running. I was in the Air Force there. So I'd go out and just jog a mile or so every couple of days. And when I got back to the States, I was a teacher. I went back into teaching again, which is what I'd done before I went to the Air Force. And I coached track, and so I stayed very close to what the athletes are doing. I continued to run with them and such. And then in 1980, I decided to open a running store. That was the first running store was opened about 1978. And so mine was just shortly after that. There's probably only a half a dozen running stores in the U.S. when I opened my store. Wow. A little town in Colorado called Fort Collins. And the store was called For the Rockies. It's still there in Fort Collins, under new ownership, of course. And so that got me involved in working with athletes face-to-face, adult athletes. I had been coaching track before that in high school. So now I had lots of runners coming into my store wanting to train for an event, a marathon, a 10K, whatever. And they knew I had a master's degree in exercise science, so they would ask, well, how do I do that? And I would give them my opinions on how to do it while I'm selling a pair of running shoes. And that went on for a couple of years, and finally I got to the point I was actually coaching people, quite a few people. And by 1987, I decided I really wanted to leave retail and just go into coaching. And so I sold the running store. I kept on coaching athletes. I had to get a day job, though. Couldn't pay the bills from coaching. So I got a day job to pay the bills and kept on coaching. And finally, in 1992, I had enough athletes I was coaching that I could quit my day job. Wow. And so it's been going on ever since then.
That's really neat. What type of athletes were you coaching? Were you kind of all across the board? Was it mostly kind of elite athletes? Who all were you coaching at the time?
No, it was primarily age group runners.
Okay,
is where I started, and they were my customers. They would come in the store.
Wow.
And so I got to know them quite well because of that, and they got to know me, I guess. And so that's how the relationships started. I didn't start coaching elite athletes until much later on.
Okay.
So I really started out working primarily with novices and age groupers.
That's really neat. The what was it when you were just first opening up the running store and kind of in the area were there many triathletes up in that area at the time? Was it kind of really still new as far as a sport when you first started coaching triathletes at the time?
Yeah, there weren't very many triathletes at all in the early 1980s. But I became really fascinated by the sport in 1983 after I did my first triathlon. I'd been running for many years, and I tried a triathlon, and I really kind of fell in love with the sport. And that one thing led to another. The next thing you know, I decided to buy the bike store next to my running store, take out the wall between the two, and bring in swimming gear. And I had it was the first triathlon store in the world in 1984. World was not ready for a triathlon store in 1984. And so it really was not a good financial decision to make. There may have been 20 triathletes in town. You really can't run a business off of 20 people. They thought it was great. They came in their swim, bike, and run gear. But the runners who came into my store after I made the change want to know what all the bikes were doing in there. Cyclists who came in expecting to find the old cycling store wanted to know what all the running shoes were doing in there. And so it became kind of a confusing situation for lots of people because the sport of triathlon wasn't very well known at all and wasn't very well populated. And so that made it very difficult to get going. But eventually, short term, it was a bad decision. Long term, it's probably the best decision I ever made in my life.
Have you seen the sport kind of, especially from a triathlon standpoint, and as you've seen it over the years change, was there a point that it really went from kind of very small and not much attention? Could you point your finger at something that changed? Was it a particular year? Was it an event, or was it just a process? Was there anything that kind of changed that really kind of put it mainstream?
Yeah, there was. It was actually not all that long ago, 2000, when the Sydney Olympics decided to include triathlon. I'd been keeping records on how many people, for example, belong to the USA Triathlon Federation, and how many people when they signed up for coaching. But this time my coaching business was fairly big, and I had assistant coaches working for me. So I would keep records on how many runners contacted looking for a coach, and runners and cyclists, mountain bikers, triathletes. And in 2000, after the Olympics, the numbers for both members in USAT and also looking for coaching services for triathlon just went skyrocketing. It went straight up. The triathletes became the dominant force of all the sports that we were working with. and continues to remain that way too. It's still the fastest growing sport of all the sports that I'm involved with.
Yeah, now I would love kind of follow-up question on that is, especially from someone who was just running and then kind of dipped their toes in the water from a triathlon standpoint. How does becoming a triathlete, how does it make you a better runner? Because obviously it does. I've got good friends of mine who are getting more involved in the sport, and it's obviously, even though they're running less miles, they're becoming a better athlete and even a better runner. So for some of us athletes who aren't doing triathlons or who don't do probably enough cross training with us on the bike or in the pool, how does the sport help make us better runners?
Well, I had actually kind of the opposite experience when I first became a triathlete. I'd been running, as I mentioned, for many, many years. And, I did a triathlon. It was Olympic distance, which meant a 10K run at the end. Mm-hmm. And I was blown away by how slow my time was compared to what I would normally run at 10K. And I had these expectations that I would simply run the same times I normally ran off of a bike. And it took me a while to figure out that's not the case, that you really can't, because there's this thing called fatigue that kind of creeps in over the course of the swim and the bike. And so I had to kind of adjust to that. But once I did, I became a much smarter athlete. There weren't any junk miles left anymore. If you were going for a run, there had to be a reason to go for a run. So I became really much more focused on what my training should be like as a runner. And I think that really kind of helped, although it's hard to say because as you get older, you're also experiencing a decline in performance. And so this was happening to me at the same time I was becoming a triathlete. And so it was an interesting mix of things going on in my life, but nevertheless, it really caused me to stop and think about how do you really train to become a good runner as a triathlete, and I learned from that how to be a better runner as simply as a runner, because you have to remain very, very focused when you have three sports you're working on. You really can't get sloppy with your training. So in that way, it really does help you to become more. To become a better runner in the long term.
Right. Is there and I know we're getting, I don't want to get deep into too many training questions, but from a training perspective, is there a particular way, as people are looking at training for triathlons, is there a particular way that you always recommend kind of, a beginner's approach to getting into the sport? And hey, here's kind of the basics of what's going to require out of you per week from a training perspective?
Yeah, when somebody first gets started, it's a very confusing sport when you're first starting. I should say that to begin with. It's not, it's much more complex than running is, right? Because you're trying to become, pretty well established in three sports, and you've got a limited amount of time. So let's say if somebody has 6 hours a week to train, and they're a runner, they can run 6 hours a week, and that's going to produce a pretty good runner. But if you've got 6 hours a week to train, you're going to do three sports. That averages out to 2 hours per sport. So how do you improve performance on 2 hours of swimming, biking, and running? And that becomes a real challenge. So the athlete has to learn, if they're coming from a running background, for example, just as I did, that it's going to be, you're not going to start out running as fast as you were before because we're changing the focus of your training. And you have to put emphasis, in this case, on the other two sports because they're obviously going to be the weak sports for a runner who's taken up the sport of triathlon. So we go through this process of learning how to train, and as the athlete does that, they become stronger at the other two sports, and things begin to balance out. And then they're also usually able, after a year or so, to add in more volume to their training. When they usually start out, it's usually two workouts per week per sport, mm-hmm. and after a while, they get up to 3 workouts per week per sport, and eventually, after many years, they maybe get to the point they're doing 2 or 3 workouts per day in 3 sports. So it's a long process. It's not going to happen overnight. Trying to make it happen overnight is a good way to wind up injured and burned out. So the athlete has to be prepared for kind of a long phase of becoming a triathlete.
Is there a particular sport that you see a lot of new people struggle with the most? Is it the swim, from a form perspective?
Yeah, swim is probably the most challenging to become good at. I recall when I first started out swimming for triathlon, I figured, well, it's pretty much the same as running. I need to do these workouts like I was a runner. One difference is I'm in a pool, and so I tried that, and I realized over time I was really not getting any place. I'm just creating a lot of froth around myself and working hard in the water, but not going any faster. And so consequently, I had to learn. I learned that the most important thing for a novice swimmer is not so much fitness per se, in the traditional way of thinking about fitness, but rather what might be called economy or technique, form. That was the key to it. And once I learned that, then I became a much better swimmer as soon as I realized that the issue was not just working hard, it was working with good technique all the time and never breaking down, becoming sloppy with your technique. And so I became a much better swimmer, and that became a learning lesson for me in working with other athletes, that the most important thing for the age group triathlete as far as swimming is concerned is becoming really well established in terms of technique.
And this is a much different question than just as a running coach, but can you see success, or can you get to a point where you can actually enjoy a triathlon and see some success without being coached? Or it seems like one of those sports to me that it's going to be very, very challenging to kind of find your way if you're not somehow getting coached.
Yeah, coaching certainly helps. There's no doubt about that. As with almost anything in life, if you're new at something, you find somebody who's very experienced at it, knows how to coach you on that, whatever that thing is. You'll progress a lot faster than if you try to figure it out for yourself. That said, I've known lots of athletes who were self-coached who did extremely well. Mm-hmm. They figured it out. They were, in most cases, very analytical, and they understood some of the science of training and what they had to do to get to where they wanted to go. But those people are pretty few and far between. You can become good at the sport, triathlon, just by simply starting out and try it. You don't have to spend a lot of money. Just go sign up for a triathlon, a sprint distance triathlon, and try it. Train, 2 swims, 2 bikes, 2 runs a week. That's one each day with a day off. And the person will improve, no doubt about it. And eventually they'll say to themselves, well, how could I get faster? And they'll figure out the answer to that question. They'll keep asking that question. Eventually the answer is going to be find a coach. Yep. So it's typically the pattern they go through.
As I watch some of the Ironman competitions, that just makes me shake my head to look at a guy who will ride doing 2.4 mile swim and 112 miles on a bike, and then he'll have the ability to throw down to 245 or 240 marathon, and just boggles my mind. Are there anything that stand out from elite athletes that makes one a great Ironman triathlete? Are there a couple characteristics that stand out, and are there any lessons as age groupers that we feel like we can learn from some of those elites?
Well, it's the things that stand out for elite athletes are in triathlon, the same things that stand out for elite athletes in running or cycling or mountain biking or whatever the sport may be, endurance sports. Those 3 things are always the same 3 things. There's only 3 things you can do to become a better athlete, endurance athlete. Mm-hmm. First is to increase your aerobic capacity, which is usually called VO2 max. That can be done by doing lots of volume, which is kind of a slow, tedious way to get there. And eventually you'll reach a performance cap well short of what your potential is. The other way to improve VO2 max is to do a more interval type training, high intensity training, add aerobic capacity, pace, for example, or power, depending what the sport may be. And that will take you to a higher level, but it's risky. There's more now. You're talking about the risk of injury and burnout and so forth. So neither one is perfect, but it takes some balance between volume and intensity to get that part, that third of becoming good, well-established VO2 max. Second thing is that all endurance athletes, elite endurance athletes have, is a lactate threshold, which is a very high percentage of their aerobic capacities. The lactate threshold is the point at which you begin to redline. It's well before you're going to have to stop. can keep it going for quite a long time, perhaps for an hour, but it hurts, really a lot for an hour. It's a long time to stay at your lactate threshold, but it can be done. The good athletes are at a very high percentage of VO2 max when they're at lactate threshold. They may be at around 90% of VO2 max when they're at the threshold, whereas a novice may be at 60%. And so that takes a lot of training also. That takes a lot of work done at or around the lactate threshold that started the red zone. And by doing more training at that level, the body begins to adapt and becomes faster at that level as a percentage of VO2 max. And so that improves. That's the second way all elite athletes are good, is they're very good at that. And the third way is something we've already talked about, which is economy, how efficient one moves. No matter what the sport is, elite runners are generally quite efficient in their running. Elite cyclists are very efficient typically in pedaling a bicycle. Swimmers the same way for their sport. So efficiency or economy is a big part of this, and that's improved by number one, lots of time. The more years you put in the sport, the more economical you become. It's improved by doing high intensity training. It's improved by doing high volume training. So it's a combination of things will improve economy. The elite athlete is really good in all three of those, but they tend to stand each athlete will tend to stand out in one of those three more than they will in the other two. And yet there'll be another elite athlete who's got a different mix of those three. They're better at a different one than the first athlete was, but they're good at all three of them. They've got a high VO2 max, but one athlete's got extremely high VO2 max. Another athlete has a low VO2 max relatively. However, it may be extremely economical. So it's a bit of physiology we're talking about here, but at all levels, it always comes down to those three things.
Gotcha. That's really good. One of the things I heard in an interview the other day, I think it was at the trials, and it was an athlete who, I think she remarked how she hated her coach for the last 6 months or something like that. And we all know the relationship a coach and an athlete have, and there certainly has to be that, stretching the athlete. Are there some things, especially since you coach so many coaches now, are there some things that you think stand out to what makes a great coach a great coach?
Yeah, there's probably lots of things that are unique to the individual. I've known really good coaches who don't operate the same way at all. They're nothing alike, and yet they're very successful. I've known coaches, for example, who really are mean and tough and push their athletes extremely hard and take them to their limits all the time, and not only physiologically but psychologically, and actually become disliked by the athletes, but they become extremely good athletes. On the other hand, I've known coaches who are extremely nice to their athletes and treat them with great respect, and yet they still are able to take their athletes to extremely high levels also. So there are different ways of doing it. It all comes down to personality types. Some athletes get along with certain types of coaches better than others. Certain coaches are more adept at what they do in their unique way, and they couldn't adopt somebody else's way of doing it. It wouldn't work for them. So I think there's just a big mix of all the possibilities of how a coach and athlete can work together, and that's what produces good athletes. But it's not always the same things.
Did it depend on an athlete of your relationship with a coach? Did you have a different type of relationship with some athletes than you did with the other, or was your coaching generally the same across the board?
I think my relationship with the athletes was much the same, with little tweaks here and there. For example, some athletes, when you say, how did your workout go, they will tell you every detail that happened, and if the workout took 2 hours, it'll be a 2-hour discussion of what happened. And they're going to tell you everything. And then there are athletes who won't tell you anything. It's one-syllable answers to questions. And so as a coach, you've got to be able to deal with different types of athletes. And that's just one example of how athletes are different.
Right.
They're different in many different ways. And so as a coach, you have to be able to adapt your style within certain boundaries. You're not going to totally change everything, but within certain boundaries, change your style to fit the athletes you're working with. I think that's what makes for a good coach.
That's really good. Do you have any athletes over the years that really surprised you? Did you ever take on athletes you're like, I didn't know, and you got more out of them than you thought?
Yeah. In 1997, December of 1997, or actually around that same time, I was getting lots of contacts because it had just been announced that Sydney Olympics was going to have triathlon in it in 2000. And so I was getting contacted by a lot of triathletes who were a lot of them new to the sport, and they thought making the triathlon team, U.S. team in triathlon, would be pretty cool. And so lots and lots of athletes are contacting me, and basically, most of them stood no chance. But I had one guy contact me in December of 1997. I was a bit skeptical at first, but the more I talked with him, the more I thought he had some potential. He had been an All-American runner in college. He'd been swimming his whole life. He'd been biking his whole life, mostly cross-training for running. Mm-hmm. And he wanted to take a shot at going to the Olympics. And so I decided to take him on, and it turned out he was the best athlete I've ever coached in my career.
Wow.
He made the Olympic team, went on to be, after the Olympics in 2000, to become an Ironman triathlete, won an Ironman competition national championship, was an extremely good athlete. And so he was really, for me, was an eye-opener. I made the right decision to work with him back in that night when I talked to him on the telephone back in 1997. And he was a rare find in many, many ways, not only physiologically, but also psychologically. He just had he had all the pieces he needed to be a great athlete. He just needed some coaching, some direction, somebody to keep him going the right direction anyway.
That's neat. Are there particular athletes that have a natural bent toward triathlon? So, for instance, like if they have a background, is it easier if someone has a running background or a swimming or a cycling, or does it just kind of vary across the board?
Yeah, if I had to make a choice, it'd be just like that guy I started coaching in '97. I'd look for an athlete who's new to the sport but has a background in running. I think that's the key to it. I think swimming, the whole key there is good technique. You've got to learn good technique. That can be done. We don't have to worry about fitness so much. It's just technique.
Right.
Cycling is really just time in the saddle. We need to get a lot of time on the bike and start doing certain specific workouts to bring that along, but it'll come along very nicely for a novice. But for running, the issue with running is it takes years to become a good runner. You've got to get your legs adapted to the stress of the pounding. And so consequently, you just can't do it in a matter of a few months. It's going to take a few years. And in that meantime, in the time where you're trying to develop as a runner, you've got to be very cautious so you don't get injured. And injuries are the things that tends to hold back athletes from taking up triathlon running injuries. And so you've got to be very cautious there with the new runner. So you can't do a whole lot to bring them along because it's just too risky. So if given a choice, I would want somebody who's got a long background in running, much as this guy I coached started in 1997. He had started running when he was in grade school, became a distance runner in junior high school, then college, and ran after college. And so he had exactly the mix I was looking for an elite triathlete.
Having never done an Ironman, I've always wanted to ask someone this question. So looking at that event, coming off the bike, knowing you've got a marathon ahead of you, I've always wondered what is the toughest part of an Ironman? Is it the physicality of it? Is it the brutal nature of that many miles, or is it a combination of the two? Because I'm just thinking mentally, I know how I feel the morning of a marathon, and I did not do 112 on the bike and 2.4 on the swim. What is it? What's the toughest part of that Ironman?
Yeah, I think you're right. It's the mental part. The old saying is that you eat an elephant one bite at a time. And that's kind of the way you have to look at it that day. You can't think about what you're going to do that day. Mm-hmm. It's going to take however many hours, 8, 9, 10, 12, 17 hours to do this thing. And you really can't get too involved in what the time is going to be when you get to the other end where the finish line is. It's going to have to be the sort of thing where you just take it one bite at a time. You get into the swim and you deal with getting to the turnaround, and then you deal with getting back to the transition to the bike and so forth. So you take it one bite at a time and you get your way through it. As far as where does the most difficult part occur physically, I think it occurs at 2 points. It occurs at the start of the bike. The biggest challenge I see for most triathletes in Ironman is they start the bike way too hard, much too hard. And because of that, they blow up and they have a terrible race. And so it's very, very difficult to get that right. And that's a mental skill. You've got to learn to pace yourself through the early part of the bike when everybody's passing you who's going to blow up later on. And you've got to let them go and just race your own race. And the other part is, there's an old saying, I forgot, one of the pro triathletes said this many, many years ago, that the marathon is 20 miles of hope and 6 miles of reality. And that's kind of what it works out to, is when you get to the last 10K, that's the part where, you've got to get mentally be prepared to get through that last 10K to the finish line, no matter if you're racing to get on the podium or just racing to finish. It's just grueling to get to the finish line from that 20-mile point.
Did you have a favorite distance of the races?
Personally?
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
You mean coaching or racing?
I'd say either one. I'd say both.
Well, for racing, my favorite distance was the Olympic distance, which is the quarter of an Ironman distance, basically. I did most of my racing back in the 80s and 90s. And back in those days, the Ironman really wasn't that big a deal back then.
Right.
Today, it's kind of the driving force behind the sport. But back then, the driving force behind the sport was the Olympic distance. There was, in the 80s and early 90s, there was an event called the U.S. Triathlon Series, which was all around the country, and it was all Olympic distance races. In fact, that's the distance. That's the event that established the Olympic distance as the standard. And so that's what I raced in, because there was a prize money for masters and separate starts for masters athletes who were in the elite division. And so it was a lot of fun to be an old guy and still racing right behind the pros for money. So that was my favorite. As a coach, my favorite really has been Ironman. I enjoy getting people ready for an event that is as challenging as that is. Because there is so much involved in trying to get there for someone who especially has never done one before, or even if they have done one before, trying to improve and produce a faster time is always a gigantic challenge. And it's the sort of challenge that athletes become extremely focused over to the point that their lifestyle begins to reflect their preparation to do that distance of a race. So it's a lot of fun because you become a real strong team when you're working with an Ironman athlete.
That's neat. I was looking at your book the other day, and would love to get any, as we begin to wrap up, I want to be respectful of your time, but would love to get some thoughts as someone who I have noticed that father time is undefeated, and as you age, the recovery time changes quite a bit, but would love to just get some thoughts for you, for some of us, hey, whether we're triathletes or runners, just any quick suggestions you might have, and we'll put the link to your book up here as well in the show notes, but would love just any just kind of quick suggestions you might have for runners who are kind of approaching or past the kind of the masters, or approaching kind of that 50-year-old mark, and just any recommendations or suggestions you have for aging runners.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. The biggest challenge that the athlete faces as they get older is recovery. At first, it doesn't seem like it's much. When you're in your 40s, you may be aware that it's taking a little bit longer. But you get into your late 50s, especially 60s and so forth, 70s and so forth, and there's absolutely no doubt that becomes a dominant force in how you do as far as training and racing is concerned, because it becomes much more difficult to recover. You got to be smarter at recovery. Mm-hmm. When you're young, a young athlete can make all kinds of mistakes and get away with it. I recall when I was in college, my coach used to have us do 5 days a week. My track coach have us do this workout, which is basically anaerobic endurance training. It was extremely painful, really high intensity. We'd do it 5 days a week.
Wow.
And somehow at the age of 20, I would spring back from that and be ready to do it again the next day.
That's crazy.
Today I could do one of those maybe every week, and I might be able to spring back by the following week to do the workout again, because that's no way I could do it 5 times in a row. So and you can make all kinds of mistakes. When you're 20 years old, you can eat junk food all you want. You can miss sleep. You can just do all kinds of things that your body won't even come close to dealing with when you're 50 years old. 50, 60, 70 years of age, your body's going to have everything just right. You're going to have to get your diet just right, get the sleep just right. You cannot make mistakes. If you do make mistakes, you're going to wind up missing training. If you miss a training, your fitness is going to decline extremely fast. Whereas when you're 20 years old, it goes down just a little bit. At 50 years old, your fitness drops dramatically when you miss workouts because of injuries, for example. So it becomes a much greater challenge, and that becomes the dominant force in your training. It's not what can you do as far as hard workouts, it's how can you recover from them.
Yeah. For those who are listening who have been predominantly runners, any quick suggestions or best resources or best places to go for them if they're interested in kind of dabbling at least in the triathlon field?
Yeah, I wrote a book called Your First Triathlon, and the purpose was to take somebody who is brand new to the sport and take them through a sprint distance race by walking them through the various parts of their training program over the course of the season, the course of 12 weeks, to get ready for a race. And so I still get a lot of feedback from athletes who have followed that book and have done extremely well in getting involved in the sport, and eventually go on to do other events, other longer events, and wind up eventually doing Ironman distance race. I occasionally get those emails that say, hey, 3 years ago I read your book and I did my first sprint. This last weekend I just did an Ironman. That's really great to hear from athletes when they're able to pull things off like that and come a really long way in a very short period of time.
That's really great. Appreciate that. We'll make sure and put those links out there if you're a runner, so you'll have access to that as well. And hey, Joe, I just wanted to say thank you again. I promise you, even as a guy who I've never, you're piquing my interest. I haven't done a triathlon, but I tell you what, your name to me has been just as familiar as Hal Higdon and Jeff Galloway. So you have done so much in the industry. And so I'm very grateful for the coaching you've done over the years and the resource you continue to put out. So just very grateful you have spent a few minutes with us on the phone today too.
Trey, thank you very much. Very flattering to say that, and I enjoyed it anytime.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Joe.
Bye.